The auctioneer hadn't even finished speaking when Dale Rutherford leaned across the fence rail and said it loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "Somebody ought to call the county. Woman's lost her mind." He wasn't whispering. He wanted her to hear it. He wanted everyone to hear it. Evelyn Hartwell stood 12 feet away, holding a bidding paddle with a cracked handle, and she didn't flinch. Not once. She just kept her eyes on the pen. 42 piglets that nobody else would touch, runty and undersized and already half dismissed by every serious farmer in Callaway County. She raised that paddle anyway. And Dale laughed. The kind of laugh that wasn't really about humor. The kind that was meant to follow a person home. What would you have done? Standing there, broke, grieving, and surrounded by people who'd already written your ending? If this story makes you feel something, subscribe right now and hit that bell. I tell stories like this every week, and I don't want you missing the ones that matter most. Drop a like and leave a comment with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Dale Rutherford decided to humiliate Evelyn Hartwell in front of half the county. The sky was the color of old dishwater, and the temperature hadn't cracked 40 degrees since November. It was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically. It just settled into your bones and stayed there, quiet and mean, the way certain kinds of grief do. Evelyn was already awake when the sun came up. Not because she'd slept well, but because sleep had stopped being something that happened to her easily somewhere around the third week after the funeral. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and counted the ways she was failing, and then she got up and put on her coat and went outside because the ceiling wasn't doing her any good. The farm looked different in winter, smaller somehow. Thomas had always said the land looked biggest in June, when the fields were up and the orchard was full and the whole place seemed to breathe. Evelyn hadn't understood what he meant until the first winter without him, when she walked the property and realized she was looking at something that had stopped breathing. 200 acres of stopped breathing. She owed the bank $11,000 by March. She had about $400 left in her checking account, a wood stove that worked when it wanted to, and a southern hill covered in dead apple trees that hadn't produced a single piece of fruit in 3 years. The county extension agent had come out in October and walked through the orchard with her, nodding slowly the way men do when they've already made up their minds but haven't figured out how to say it yet. "Soil's compacted," he'd said finally. "Root systems are stressed. These trees aren't dead yet, technically, but..." He'd trailed off, which told her more than the rest of the sentence would have. Technically. That word had stayed with her. Thomas would have argued with the man. He'd have stood there in his worn-out work boots and told the county extension agent that he didn't know this land the way they did, that these trees had been through hard years before and come back, that there was a difference between a tree that was dying and a tree that was waiting. But Thomas wasn't there to argue with anyone anymore. And Evelyn, alone in the kitchen that night, hadn't been sure which one of them was right. She'd gone looking after that. Not for reassurance, she'd stopped expecting that from the people around her, but for information. She dug through Thomas's farming books, the old ones with broken spines and margins full of his handwriting, the ones she'd never paid much attention to when he was alive, because she'd assumed she could always ask him later. She read about soil compaction and root health and the biology of orchard recovery. She read about methods that had gone out of fashion, old practices that predated chemical inputs and mechanical tilling, approaches that modern farming had largely set aside in favor of faster solutions. And somewhere in the middle of a chapter she'd read 3 times without fully understanding, something clicked. Pigs. Not as livestock, not as product, as a tool. The idea seemed almost embarrassingly simple once she understood it. Pigs, turned loose in a compacted orchard, would root through the hardened soil. They'd break it up naturally, the way no tiller could, getting down into the layers where root systems needed air and moisture. They'd eat the fallen, rotting fruit that harbored disease. They'd deposit manure that would break down into the kind of organic matter that sick soil desperately needed. It had worked for centuries in places where people still knew about it. Before the age of inputs and quick fixes, it was how orchards were restored. The problem was that Evelyn had $400 and 11,000 reasons to be conservative with it. The problem was that she had to make this work on the first try. She found the auction listing 3 days later in a regional farming circular that had been sitting on the kitchen table unread since sometime in October. A livestock dispersal in Hendricks County, 60 miles east, The ad mentioned several lots of feeder pigs, standard weights, standard breeds. Nothing special. But at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, there was a note. Runt lot, 42 head, various breeds, underweight, price to move. Evelyn read that line 4 times. Underweight pigs at a dispersal auction would go for almost nothing. Buyers wanted uniform animals that would hit target weight on a predictable schedule. Runts were a gamble, a complication, a thing that experienced farmers avoided because the margins were already thin enough without adding extra variables. Nobody at that auction would be fighting her for 42 undersized piglets. She folded the circular and put it in her coat pocket and didn't tell anyone what she was thinking. Not yet, possibly not ever. Because she understood already that what she was considering would sound insane to everyone she knew, and she didn't have the energy to defend it before she'd even decided. She drove to the auction alone on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks later, in Thomas's truck with the heater that worked intermittently and the passenger seat still adjusted to his height. She didn't adjust it. She wasn't sure why. The auction barn smelled like hay and manure and diesel and the particular damp cold of a building that's never quite warm enough. Evelyn had been to livestock auctions before. She and Thomas had gone together years back when they were younger and the farm was smaller and every purchase felt like an adventure rather than a risk. She'd forgotten how loud they were, how fast the bidding moved, how you had to stay sharp or miss your moment entirely. She found a seat near the back and watched the first several lots move through. She wasn't bidding on anything else. She needed to know what the room felt like, who was there, what the money was doing. The serious buyers were easy to spot. They came in with notebooks or phones. They watched the animals with the particular professional focus of people who were doing math in their heads continuously. They bid confidently and stopped confidently and moved on without visible regret. Evelyn watched them and thought about Thomas, who had always said you could learn more from watching an auction than from bidding in one. She was thinking about that when Dale Rutherford sat down 3 rows in front of her. She knew Dale the way you know anyone in a county this size. Not well, but completely. He ran 500 acres of row crops 2 miles east of her property, and he had the manner of a man who had been right about enough things over enough years that he'd stopped questioning whether he might be wrong. He was practical the way certain men are practical, not because they'd thought carefully about the world, but because they'd found a version of it that worked for them and saw no reason to consider others. He'd come to the funeral, said the right things, brought a covered dish that his wife had made, and then, 3 weeks later, he'd driven past her property and stopped and said through his truck window while she was checking the mailbox that he knew a buyer who'd pay fair price for the acreage if she decided to let it go. Said it like he was doing her a favor. Said it with the particular gentleness of someone who has already assumed the outcome. "It's a lot for one person," he'd said. "Thomas would want you to be practical." She'd thanked him and gone inside and stood at the kitchen sink for a long time with the water running. Now he was 3 rows ahead of her, and he hadn't noticed her yet, and she wasn't going to announce herself. The runt lot came up 40 minutes into the auction. 42 piglets moved into the ring in a portable pen, and you could see immediately why they'd been separated out. They were a mixed group, different breeds, different colorings, wildly inconsistent in size. Some looked nearly healthy. A few were visibly undersized, their shoulder bones prominent, their energy spent on staying warm rather than growing. The auctioneer noted the lot with the minimal enthusiasm of a man describing something he expected to sell quickly and cheaply just to clear it. Evelyn raised her paddle on the opening bid. That was when Dale turned around and saw her. She watched him process it, the recognition, then the puzzle of what she was doing here. Then his eyes moving to the pen of runts in the ring, then back to her, then the slow construction of an expression that wasn't quite a smile. "Evelyn Hartwell," he said, loud, conversational, not caring who heard. "You're not seriously looking at those." "I'm here, aren't I?" she said. He turned to the man next to him, someone she didn't recognize, and said something she couldn't hear. The man glanced back at her. Then Dale said louder, the thing she'd already quoted at the top of this story. "Somebody ought to call the county. Woman's lost her mind." The people nearby either laughed quietly or went carefully still, the way people do when someone else is being embarrassed, and they're not sure whether to acknowledge it or pretend they didn't hear. The auctioneer kept talking, indifferent, the bid rising in small increments toward a number that Evelyn already knew was the most she could spend and still feed them through spring. She kept the paddle up. Dale watched her for a moment with something she couldn't quite name. Not quite contempt, not quite concern. Something in between. The look of a man who has decided someone is making a mistake and feels mildly justified by it. "Those animals are going to eat your last dollar," he said. Not cruelly, just factually, the way he delivered most things. "You know that, right?" "They might," she said. "That orchard's done, Evelyn. Has been for 2 years. You can't fix dead with pigs." "It's not dead," she said. And because she didn't want to explain herself, because she didn't have the vocabulary for what she was trying to do in terms that would make sense to him in the next 30 seconds, and because the auctioneer was about to close the lot, she just looked back at the ring and kept the paddle up. Dale shook his head. He said something else that she didn't catch, and then he turned around and stopped watching her because there was nothing else to see. She got the lot for $260. 42 piglets. Everything she had left, nearly. She sat with the paddle in her lap for a moment after the gavel came down, and she felt something she hadn't expected, not confidence, not relief, but a kind of cold clarity, the specific calm that comes when you've made a decision that can't be undone and the pretending is finally over. Thomas would have had something to say about that, probably. He always had something to say about the moment when a choice stopped being a choice and became a fact. She missed that. She missed the particular way he talked about things, like every experience was worth describing carefully, like words were a way of understanding what had just happened rather than just reporting it. She'd taken that for granted, she knew now, the way you take anything for granted that you don't know is going to end. She loaded the piglets into the trailer she'd borrowed from her neighbor Carol, who'd asked no questions and asked only that the trailer come back cleaner than it left. And she drove 60 miles home in Thomas's truck, with 42 animals behind her and a little over $140 to her name, and the absolute certainty that she had either just saved the farm or finished destroying it. She didn't know which yet. That was the part nobody could tell her. The orchard waited on the southern hill the way it had been waiting for years, gray trees and packed ground and the particular quiet of a place that has given up. But Evelyn had decided, somewhere between the auction and home, that she was going to disagree with that assessment. The orchard wasn't finished. It was waiting. She'd seen it in Thomas's face, in the old books with his handwriting in the margins, in the hours she'd spent reading and rereading about the biology of recovery and what happened when you gave exhausted land what it actually needed instead of what was easy. She pulled through the gate and down the lane and parked behind the barn, and for a moment she just sat in the truck with her hands on the steering wheel and the engine ticking cool in the winter air. Then she got out, opened the trailer, and let the work begin. The first night was the worst. Not because anything went dramatically wrong. No animal escaped, no fence collapsed, no crisis arrived at 2 a.m. demanding immediate solutions. It was worse than that. It was just 42 small, cold, exhausted animals in a temporary pen behind the barn, and Evelyn standing outside in the dark with a flashlight, counting them for the 3rd time because she couldn't think of anything else useful to do, and the absolute silence of the farm pressing in from every direction. She counted 42. Again. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the notepad where she'd written out her rough calculations 3 days before. Feed costs, projected weight gain, the timeline she'd need to hold to if this was going to work, before the bank's March deadline became something she couldn't negotiate around. The numbers had looked reasonable when she'd written them. They looked thinner now, with the actual animals behind the actual barn and the actual temperature dropping toward actual single digits overnight. She made herself a cup of coffee she didn't want and drank half of it standing at the sink, looking at the dark window that showed nothing but her own reflection and the faint outline of the barn light behind it. Thomas's coat was still hanging on the hook by the back door. She hadn't moved it. She wasn't ready to move it, and she'd stopped expecting herself to be ready on any particular schedule. Some mornings she walked past it without looking. Some mornings she stood next to it for longer than made sense and breathed through her nose until the feeling passed. Tonight she just looked at it from across the kitchen and then looked away. She went to bed at 10 and lay awake until past midnight, and at some point she must have slept because the alarm startled her at 5 and her heart was pounding the way it does when your body wasn't finished with the dark. She got up. She put on the coat. She went out. This was how the days started after that. Not with intention exactly, not with confidence, but with the simple act of getting up and doing the next thing. because the next thing was always there waiting, and the only alternative was to stop. The piglets were alive in the morning. They were cold and hungry and vocal about both, and Evelyn fed them and checked them and repaired a section of the temporary pen that one of the larger animals had been testing overnight. She moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing physical work their whole life, not gracefully but effectively, knowing which tasks mattered and which ones could wait, and how to triage a morning when there was more to do than time to do it. By the end of the first week, she'd established something like a rhythm. By the end of the second, the rhythm had settled into something she could almost call routine. She released the first group of piglets into the orchard on a Thursday morning in early January, 17 days after the auction, when the ground had thawed enough from a brief warm spell to give the animals something to work with. She didn't do it all at once. She'd read enough to know that you introduced them in sections, moving the group through different areas so they worked the soil systematically rather than tearing up one spot and leaving others untouched. She opened the gate to the orchard's western section and stood back. For a moment, nothing happened. The animals stood at the gate opening, uncertain, the way creatures are uncertain about new spaces they haven't learned yet. Then the boldest one, a middle-sized animal with one torn ear that she'd started privately thinking of as the scout, walked through, and the rest followed in a loose, jostling group, and within 4 minutes every one of them had their snouts in the ground. Evelyn stood at the fence and watched them work and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile for what she needed. It was closer to purpose. The sense that she was doing something that had a logic to it, even if no one around her could see the logic yet. She was still standing there 20 minutes later when she heard Carol Bingham's truck coming down the road and slowing near the gate. Carol was 63, had farmed the land adjacent to Evelyn's west property line for 30 years, and was the kind of woman who said exactly what she thought with such complete lack of meanness that it never quite landed as criticism even when it was. Carol pulled over and rolled down her window and looked at the orchard for a long moment. "Pigs," she said finally. "Pigs," Evelyn confirmed. Carol was quiet for another moment. "In the orchard." "In the orchard?" Carol looked at her. She had the kind of face that had been weathered past the point where it telegraphed much. You had to know her to read her, and Evelyn had known her long enough. She wasn't mocking. She was genuinely trying to understand. "Thomas's idea?" Carol asked. "Mine," Evelyn said. "His books." Carol nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing something away rather than responding to it. "How much did you spend?" "Enough." "How much is enough?" Evelyn looked at her. $260. Carol did the math visibly, which meant she knew how much was left and what that meant. She didn't say anything about it directly, which was the kindest thing she could have done. "You need anything?" Carol said instead. "I'll let you know." Carol looked at the orchard one more time, at the animals rooting industriously through the packed earth, at the gray dormant trees above them, at the particular combination of the two that would have looked, to most eyes, like a bad situation being made worse. Then she rolled her window back up and drove on. Evelyn turned back to the fence and let out a breath she'd been holding. The problem with January was that it gave you nothing to show for your work. The soil changed. She could feel it when she walked the orchard sections after the pigs had moved through. Softer underfoot, more yielding, the faint mineral smell of turned earth that meant something biological was happening beneath the surface. But the trees looked the same. Gray bark, bare branches, the particular stillness of something that might be dead or might just be waiting and gave no outward indication of which. She'd been out in the orchard for about 3 weeks when Dale Rutherford stopped by in person. She heard his truck before she saw it, the diesel engine that he ran too hard because he could afford to. And she was at the far end of the eastern orchard section, checking a fence post when he came through the gate she'd left open. He walked with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who owned his time, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the pigs work with the expression of someone watching something he'd already evaluated and found wanting. He stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at the trees. He looked at the pigs. He looked at her. "They growing?" he said. "Steadily," she said. "Good. That's something at least." He kicked at the soil with his boot. "Softer than I'd expect." That's the point. He looked at her then, and she could see him trying to recalibrate. He'd come with a framework for this conversation, she could tell, probably something organized around concern and practicality and the specific kindness of telling someone the hard truth they weren't letting themselves hear. The soil comment had interrupted that framework slightly. "You think this is going to bring them back," he said. Not a question. The careful neutrality of a man testing a position. "I think the soil is wrong, and this fixes the soil," she said. "Whether that's enough for the trees, I don't know yet." The extension agent said, "I know what he said." "Evelyn." He said her name the way certain men say women's names when they want to signal that what follows is wisdom rather than condescension, and the effect is generally the opposite. "I farmed this county for 31 years. I know dead wood when I see it." "You know a lot of things," she said. She wasn't being sarcastic. She meant it. "You know row crops. You know input costs and equipment and margin per acre. You've been right about most of it your whole career. I'm not saying you're a fool, Dale." He blinked. "I'm saying this particular piece of land isn't your subject," she said. "Thomas spent 23 years learning it. I spent 23 years watching him learn it, and I've spent the last 3 months reading everything he kept about it, and I think the soil is what's wrong. And I think this is how you fix soil like this, and I might be wrong. But I'm not wrong because I'm grieving and not thinking clearly. I'm wrong, or I'm right on the actual merits, and we won't know until spring." Dale was quiet for a moment. The animals worked around them, indifferent to the conversation, rooting and shuffling and occasionally producing the wet snuffling sound that Evelyn had already stopped noticing. "Fair enough," he said finally. It sounded like it cost him something small. "I appreciate you coming by," she said, and meant it, and went back to the fence post. He stood there for another minute, and then she heard him walking back toward the gate, and then the truck, and then the diesel engine fading down the road. She kept working the fence post. Her hands were cold inside her gloves, and her back ached in the specific way it ached now, when she spent too long bent at the waist, a thing that hadn't happened 10 years ago, and that she'd simply incorporated into the landscape of what mornings felt like now. She worked the post until it was solid, and then straightened up and looked across the orchard. The pigs had moved to a new section on their own, following whatever it was pigs follow. Smell, instinct, the particular texture of ground that still had something worth finding. The torn-eared one she thought of as the scout was always at the edge of the group, always a few steps ahead of the others, and she'd started checking for it first when she came out in the mornings, the way you check for the reassuring presence of something familiar. She walked back toward the barn and tried not to count the days until spring, because counting made it feel further away rather than closer. February arrived with a cold that was different from January's cold. Not deeper necessarily, but more settled, more convinced of itself. The cold of a season that had stopped pretending it might break early. The kind of cold that gets inside old barns and finds every gap in the insulation and makes animals work harder just to stay warm, which meant Evelyn was working harder too. 2 of the smaller piglets had developed a cough in the second week of January that she'd caught early and treated with what she had, and watched carefully, and they'd come through it, but it had cost her 3 nights of interrupted sleep and an unexpected call to the large animal vet 2 counties over, whose fees ate into her remaining cash in a way that she'd tried not to do the exact math on. She'd done the exact math at 2 in the morning, 3 nights running. She knew the number. She was trying not to let the number make decisions for her. The vet was a woman named Dr. Patricia Hale, mid-40s, who drove a truck that had seen more miles than it had any right to and arrived at 6 in the evening with the specific competence of someone whose days didn't follow schedules. She examined the sick animals with thorough, efficient hands and asked Evelyn questions in the direct way of someone who didn't have time to soften them and trusted Evelyn to handle the answers. "How long before they need to be at working weight?" Dr. Hale asked. "March, ideally. They can keep going through March. The soil work matters more than the weight timeline anyway." Dr. Hale looked at her over the pen railing. "You're using them for the orchard?" "Yes." "Old method," the vet said. "Old orchard," Evelyn said. Dr. Hale almost smiled. She wrote out a treatment protocol and told Evelyn what to watch for and handed over a small kit of supplies with a bill that was lower than it should have been, which Evelyn noticed and didn't comment on because she needed the lower number, and acknowledging it would have made her feel something she wasn't prepared to feel right then. These two are going to be fine, Dr. Hale said, nodding toward the sick animals. The rest of the group looks better than I'd expect for how they came in. You're doing something right. I'm doing what the books say, Evelyn said. That's what doing something right usually looks like, Dr. Hale said, and drove away into the February dark. Evelyn stood in the barn for a minute after the headlights disappeared and then went inside and ate soup standing at the stove because sitting down would have meant stopping, and stopping would have meant thinking about the number she was trying not to think about. The other thing February brought was her son. Marcus drove down from Indianapolis on a Saturday morning, unannounced, which meant Carol had called him, which Evelyn had expected eventually. He was 41, tall in the way Thomas had been tall, with less of Thomas's patience and more of his stubbornness, which was saying something. He worked in logistics, had a practical mind that ran on inputs and outputs, and had spent the better part of 2 years before Thomas died asking his parents when they planned to think about what came next, about retirement, about whether the farm made sense at their ages with the land prices what they were. He'd meant it with love. It had landed like something else. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't say anything for a few minutes, which was the closest Marcus got to diplomacy. Through the window, you could see the barn and beyond it the south hill and the pale winter shape of the orchard. "How much did you spend on the pigs?" he said finally. "Enough to get started." "Mom." "Marcus." He set down the mug. "I looked up the note. I know what you owe the bank in March. I know what you have in the account. I can do the arithmetic." "I know you can," she said. "So can I." "Then you know how thin the margin is if anything goes sideways." "Nothing's gone sideways." "One vet bill," he said. "One bad stretch of weather. One animal gets into something it shouldn't, and you've got a medical situation that—" "Marcus," she said, and something in her voice stopped him. Not anger. Something quieter than anger, which in Evelyn's register carried more weight. "I know the risks. I have not stopped knowing the risks for one day since November. I know them at 5 in the morning when I go out to feed, and I know them at midnight when I can't sleep, and I know what happens if this doesn't work. I know all of it. I don't need you to explain it to me." He was quiet. "What I need," she said, "is for you to trust that I've thought this through. Not that you agree with it, not that you'd make the same choice, just that I'm not doing this because I've stopped thinking." He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way people look when they're setting aside the version of the conversation they prepared and actually seeing who's in front of them. "I don't think you've stopped thinking," he said. His voice was different now. "I think you're doing exactly what Dad would do, which is find the most difficult possible solution and commit to it completely, and I think that's terrifying to watch from the outside." Evelyn felt something move in her chest. "That's not a bad description of your father," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." He stayed through Sunday. He helped her move the pigs to a new orchard section on Sunday morning, the two of them working the gates and panels while the animals shuffled and complained and eventually moved where they were supposed to go. Marcus wasn't bad with livestock. He'd grown up doing this, even if he'd left it behind. His body remembered the work even when his mind was somewhere else. At one point, near the fence on the east side, he stopped and looked at the ground the pigs had already moved through. He crouched down and worked his fingers into the soil, the way Evelyn had been doing every few days, checking the texture, checking the depth of the loosening, comparing it against the ground further out where the animals hadn't reached yet. He looked up at her. "That's actually different," he said. "I know," she said. He stood up and brushed his hands on his jeans and didn't say anything else about it, but she saw him look back at the ground twice more before they finished. He left Sunday afternoon with the engine running and his window down. "Call me," he said. "Not just when something's wrong. Just call me." "I will," she said, and watched his car get small down the lane. She stood in the cold for a moment after he was gone, and then went back to the barn because there was always something in the barn that needed doing, and doing it was the only way she knew to keep the alternative at bay. The still voice that wondered sometimes, in the hours when work couldn't reach it, whether Thomas had known something she didn't about what this land was and wasn't capable of, and whether she was honoring his memory or misreading it. She never let that thought get very far. She picked up a shovel or a bucket or a fence tool and she put it somewhere else. The last week of February brought something she hadn't been prepared for. Not a crisis. Something stranger than a crisis. A detail. A small thing that she noticed on a Tuesday morning when the light was still gray and the temperature had not yet climbed above freezing. When she was walking the orchard section, the pigs had most thoroughly worked, checking for anything the night might have disturbed. She stopped near the base of a tree on the western edge, one she'd been watching because it was the most obviously compromised of the group, the one the extension agent had gestured toward first when he'd made his careful, not-quite prognosis in October. A tree she'd privately, quietly, let herself think of as probably already gone. She stopped because something looked wrong with the bark. Not wrong in a bad way. Wrong in the way that makes you look twice, that makes your brain flag something it wasn't expecting. She moved closer. She took her glove off and pressed her palm flat against the bark. It was different. Not dramatically, not the kind of different you'd describe easily to someone else, but the bark of a tree that is truly dead has a particular quality, a dryness, an absence of give, something that transmits through your hand like touching stone. This tree, this particular tree that she'd mostly given up on, did not feel like that. It felt like something that had stopped for a while and was thinking about whether to start again. Evelyn stood with her bare hand against the bark for a long time, long enough that the cold from the wood worked up through her palm, and she didn't let herself name what she was feeling because naming it would have made it breakable. She just stood there. The pigs worked somewhere behind her, snuffling and rooting through the January damage they'd already started transforming into something else. The sky above the orchard was the color it always was at that hour, that particular Midwestern winter gray that could mean anything or nothing. She put her glove back on. She walked back toward the barn. She did not tell anyone what she'd felt, not Carol, not Marcus, not the vet on the follow-up call she made that week. She kept it inside the way you keep something you're not ready to share yet, something you need to stay private a little longer because the world is very good at taking fragile things and breaking them with its very reasonable questions and its very understandable doubts. She kept working. She kept the routine. She kept counting 42 animals every morning, and every morning 42 animals were there. And the soil in the worked sections kept changing in the ways she'd read about and hoped for. And the trees kept standing in their winter silence and giving nothing away. And Evelyn kept her hand to herself, and her knowing to herself, and waited for spring to make the argument she couldn't yet make out loud. March arrived the way it always does in that part of the country, not with any kind of announcement, not with warmth exactly, but with a shift in the quality of the cold that told you something underneath the surface had changed its mind. The air still bit, the mornings were still dark, and the ground still held frost until midday. But the light was different. It came back a few minutes earlier each day, and the particular angle of it in the late afternoon had moved from the flat, defeated slant of February into something with a little more reach to it, something that caught the south-facing slopes and held them a few degrees warmer than the north sides, a difference you'd never notice if you weren't paying close attention. Evelyn noticed. She'd been paying close attention for 3 months straight. The bank letter arrived on the 4th of March, a Tuesday, in an envelope with the kind of official weight that you can feel through the paper before you open it. She'd known it was coming. She'd been tracking the date on the calendar above the kitchen sink with the same attention she'd been giving the soil and the animals and the slow, invisible work happening in the orchard. Knowing something is coming doesn't make it lighter when it arrives. It just means you've been carrying it longer. She opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. The language was formal and not unkind, which was somehow worse than if it had been blunt. The note was due. Extensions were available under certain conditions. There was a name and a phone number and a sentence about working with customers to find solutions. It was the kind of letter written by someone who processed dozens of them a week and had learned to make them feel personal without being personal at all. Evelyn read it twice. She set it on the table. She looked at it. Then she picked up the phone and called the number. The man she spoke to was named Gerald something, and he had a voice that was practiced at being neutral in all directions simultaneously. And he asked her questions she'd expected: current income, current assets, the status of the property, and she answered them without embellishment. When he asked about plans for making the property productive, she told him about the orchard restoration. She told him plainly, without apology, the way she'd told Marcus, what the method was, why it worked, what stage she was at. Gerald was quiet for a moment when she finished. "The pigs," he said. "The pigs," she said. Another pause. "Mrs. Hartwell, the bank's concern is—" "I know what the bank's concern is," she said. "The bank's concern is the note. I'm telling you that the orchard is the path to paying the note, and the orchard requires time that it is currently using, and I'm asking whether there's a mechanism for acknowledging that." He put her on hold for 4 minutes and 40 seconds. She counted. When he came back, he told her they could extend the deadline by 60 days to early May, contingent on a property visit from their agricultural lending officer sometime in the next 2 weeks. She said that was acceptable. He said someone would call to schedule. She thanked him and hung up and sat with her hands flat on the table for a moment. 60 days. She looked at the calendar. She looked at the window. She looked at the letter, and then she turned it face down so she didn't have to look at it anymore, and she went out to feed the animals. The lending officer's name was Robert Vance, and he arrived 10 days later in a white pickup that was clean in the way that working trucks are never quite clean, which told Evelyn something about how much time Robert Vance spent in them. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, with glasses that had a small chip in the left lens that he'd clearly stopped noticing, and he had the careful manner of someone who had seen a lot of struggling farms and had learned not to let that show on his face. He walked the property with her. The fields first, dormant, but the soil there was fine. That ground didn't need what the orchard needed. He looked at the barn and the equipment with the appraising eye of someone who was mentally cataloging depreciated value, which was his job, and she understood it. She let him do it without commentary. When they got to the orchard gate, she opened it and stood back and let him see it. He walked in slowly. He walked through the section the pigs had worked most thoroughly. The western section, the first one she'd opened in January, now 2 months into recovery. He scuffed the soil with his boot the way Dale had done, but where Dale had been testing her, Vance seemed to actually be checking. He crouched down and worked a handful of soil through his fingers and looked at it. "This is different from what I'd expect," he said, "given the condition report from October." "The condition in October was compacted, depleted soil," Evelyn said. "That's what we've been addressing." He looked up at her. "With pigs." "With pigs." He stood. He looked at the trees. He looked at them for a while, long enough that Evelyn felt the particular tension of waiting for a verdict from someone who held real power over what happened next. She didn't fill the silence. Thomas had taught her that. Not every silence was yours to fill. "These trees show any sign of life?" he said. She thought about the Tuesday morning in February, her bare hand against the bark, the thing she'd kept to herself. She measured what she was about to say. "Some of them," she said, "nothing visible yet, but the bark on several of them has changed. I've been checking manually. There's give there that wasn't there in October." He looked at her. "I know that sounds like nothing," she said. "On paper, it sounds like nothing." "It doesn't sound like nothing," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that surprised her. Something that wasn't bank language, something that came from another part of him. He looked at the trees again. "My grandfather had a small orchard, nothing like this, but I remember what he used to say about the difference between a tree that's dying and a tree that's resting." Evelyn didn't say anything. "He couldn't always explain the difference," Vance said. "He could just usually tell." He wrote something in his notebook. He didn't show her what. He told her before he left that he'd file his report that week and she'd hear from Gerald within a few days. She thanked him. He shook her hand with the formal weight of someone closing a chapter whose outcome was still being decided, and drove away in the too-clean truck. She got the call from Gerald 4 days later. The extension was confirmed. The bank would revisit in early May. He reminded her of the documentation they'd need at that point. She said she understood. She said thank you. She hung up and stood at the window and looked at the South Hill. April was when things started happening that she hadn't let herself plan for. The first week of April, she was moving the pigs to their final rotation through the eastern section, the last area of the orchard that hadn't been fully worked, when she noticed the torn-eared scout moving differently than usual. Instead of rooting ahead of the group, it had stopped at the base of a tree on the edge of the section and was standing still, which was unusual enough that Evelyn stopped what she was doing and watched it. The animal wasn't sick. It was simply still. Its nose was working, but its feet weren't moving, and it was oriented toward the base of the tree, the way animals orient toward things that smell like change. Evelyn walked over. She looked at the base of the tree and then up along the trunk and into the lower branches, the way you look at a tree when you've been looking at trees long enough to read them. She saw it. A bud. Not a blossom. Not yet. Not by several days. But a bud. Tight and small and unmistakably alive, on a branch that had looked as inert as wire all winter. She stood there for a moment. The scout shuffled away onto other business, its momentary stillness already forgotten. Evelyn looked at the bud for a long time. Then she looked at the surrounding trees. Then she walked slowly through that section, looking, really looking, the way you look when you're not hoping anymore but checking, because hope and checking are different things and only one of them is useful. On 7 trees, she found buds. She went back inside and sat at the table and did not call anyone. She needed to sit with it first. She needed it to be real before she let anyone else's reaction touch it. She'd been sitting there for about 20 minutes when the phone rang. It was Marcus. "Just checking in," he said. "How's it going?" She told him. There was silence on his end, not the skeptical silence of February. A different kind. 7 trees, he said. 7 trees, she said. He was quiet again. Then, "Mom, that's not nothing." "No," she said. "It isn't. What do you need?" "Nothing yet," she said. "I just needed to tell someone." She heard him exhale. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." They stayed on the phone for another minute without saying much, the way you do when the words have already been used and what's left is just the fact of someone being there. And then they said goodbye, and she hung up and looked out the window at the South Hill until the lights started to go. The following week was when Dale came back. She heard his truck mid-morning, a Wednesday, and she was in the orchard when he came through the gate. She'd seen him twice since February, once at the feed store, once at the end of her lane where he'd slowed and looked and driven on without stopping. She'd been aware of his presence in the county the way you're aware of weather, not focused on it, but tracking it in your peripheral attention. He walked through the gate and into the orchard and looked around with the same careful eyes he'd brought in January, except that the orchard he was looking at now was different, and he could see that. The soil through the worked sections was visibly darker. The texture was changed. Even someone without any investment in what was happening here would have noticed that the ground looked different from what it had been. He looked at the trees. He was quiet long enough that Evelyn stopped pretending to be busy with the fence line and just waited. "Those buds?" he said. He was pointing at the eastern section. "Yes," she said. He walked over. He looked at the tree the way Vance had looked at the soil, actually checked, actually examined, without the polite dismissal she'd been bracing for. He put his hand on the branch the way she'd put her hand on the bark in February, and she watched his face. Something shifted in it, small, quickly controlled, but she saw it. "How many?" he said. 7 that I've confirmed, probably more I haven't checked yet." He took his hand off the branch. He looked at the ground. He looked at the pigs working the far section, the torn-eared scout moving ahead of the group the way it always did. "How'd you know?" he said. "Thomas's books." "Thomas never mentioned this to me." "Thomas didn't mention everything to everybody," she said. Dale made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He looked at the tree again. Then he looked at her, and she saw something she hadn't seen from him before. Not an apology. He wasn't built for direct apologies. She understood that about him without rancor. It was more like an adjustment. A man encountering evidence that his model of a situation was wrong and absorbing that information. "I was wrong about the trees," he said. That was all. "You didn't know what I was doing or why," she said. "I didn't tell you." "Would you have listened if I'd asked?" "No," she said honestly. "Not to questions. I needed to do this without questions for a while." He nodded. He understood that in the way farmers understand things, not from theory, but from experience, from the times they'd had to do something that made no sense on paper and could only be proven by doing it. "What's the bank situation?" he said. "Still working on it. Extension through May. If you need a character reference at the bank, someone who can speak to the property's potential." "Dale," she said. He stopped. "I'm going to handle the bank," she said, "but thank you." He stood there a moment longer. He looked like he wanted to say more and hadn't worked out what it was yet. Then he put his hands back in his pockets and walked toward the gate, and at the gate he stopped with his hand on the latch and turned back. "That method," he said. "The pigs in the orchard. Does it work on compacted row crop ground?" She looked at him. "Depends on the ground." He nodded. "I've got a section on my east field that's been compacted for 6 years. Nothing I've done has touched it." "Come back in the fall," she said. "I'll show you the books." He opened the gate and went out. She heard his truck start and pull away, and she turned back to the orchard. The second week of April brought rain, which was both needed and complicated. The ground in the worked sections absorbed it well, one of the things she'd been hoping for. The difference in drainage behavior between compacted clay and restored soil showing itself in real time. But the eastern section, where the pigs were still working, was still in transition, and 4 days of rain turned parts of it into mud that the animals churned steadily deeper, which created a problem she hadn't fully accounted for. By the third day of rain, she had pigs knee-deep in muddy sections and a fence line on the north edge of the eastern section that the mud and animal pressure were threatening to pull loose from a post she'd been meaning to reinforce since January and hadn't gotten to. She was out in the rain at 8 in the morning trying to reset the post while the mud sucked at her boots and the animals churned around her and the rain came sideways under the brim of her hat, and she was thinking with a specific and vivid clarity about how much she hated this particular moment. Not the project, not the plan, not the farm, or the decision she'd made in January, but this specific moment with the mud and the rain and the fence post and the cold water running down the back of her neck, when Carol appeared at the gate in her rain gear. "You look like you need a hand," Carol said. Evelyn looked at her. "How'd you know?" "Drove past and saw you wrestling that post," Carol said. "Came back." She came through the gate and took the other side of the post brace, and between them they got it reset in about 20 minutes, working in the rain without much conversation because conversation wasn't what the moment needed. When it was done, they stood back and looked at it, and Evelyn felt the particular satisfaction of a physical thing fixed that had been broken, which was a satisfaction she'd needed. "Thank you," she said. Carol looked around the orchard. The rain had slowed slightly, and in the diffused light you could see the worked sections clearly. The darker soil, the different texture, the way the water was sitting on the surface differently here than it did on the untouched ground further up the hill. "It looks different," Carol said. "The ground." "It is different." Carol looked at the eastern trees. "Marcus told me about the buds," she said. Evelyn looked at her. "He called me in March," Carol said without apology. "He was worried. I told him you were fine. He didn't entirely believe me, but he took it." She paused. "He called again last week. Said you'd found buds." "7 confirmed," Evelyn said. 12 now, I think. I found 5 more yesterday morning." Carol was quiet. She looked at the trees for a long moment, the way people look at things they're revising their understanding of. "Thomas always said that orchard was worth saving," she said. "He did," Evelyn said. "I thought he was being sentimental." "Maybe he was," Evelyn said. "Doesn't mean he was wrong." Carol turned up her collar against the rain. "You going to make the bank deadline?" "I'm going to try." "If you need anything before May, I know where you are," Evelyn said. Carol nodded. She squeezed Evelyn's arm once through the rain gear, the kind of gesture that means more than most words do, and walked back to the gate. The last week of April was when the 17th tree bloomed. Not budded, bloomed. Actual blossoms, white against the gray bark, small and wet from the previous night's rain, appearing on the lower branches of a tree on the western slope that Evelyn had walked past 200 times without seeing anything but dormant wood. She found them on a Friday morning at 6:45 in the first light, and she stood in front of them for a long time. The blossom petals were small and slightly ragged at the edges from the cold they'd pushed through, and they were the most beautiful thing she'd seen in 5 months. Not because they were lovely, exactly, though they were, but because of what they meant, because of everything that had had to happen in the right order and at the right pace and without any visible confirmation for 4 months to produce this specific outcome. She put her hand against the branch below the blossoms. The wood was warm under her fingers. Not warm from the air. The morning was still barely above 40. Warm from inside. She didn't call anyone that morning. She took a photograph with her phone, badly framed, the light still too gray for the image to show what she was actually seeing. She looked at the photograph and it looked like nothing. She put her phone in her pocket. She went back to the barn and fed the animals and did the morning's work and let the fact of the blossom sit inside her without anyone else's knowledge touching it yet, because she was starting to understand that some things needed to be yours for a little while before they could be shared without losing something important in the translation. By the end of the day, the blossoms were on 3 more trees. By the end of the week, the eastern section was showing buds on nearly every tree she'd written off in the winter, and the torn-eared scout, who had been the first animal through the first gate on that January morning, stood at the fence line on the south edge of the orchard on a Thursday evening while Evelyn was making her last rounds, and looked out across the hill with the settled quality of an animal that has done what it came to do and knows it. Evelyn stopped beside it for a moment. She leaned on the fence. She looked out across the orchard the way the animal was looking. The south hill in the late April light, with the white beginning to appear among the gray branches, looked different from everything that had come before. Not fixed, not finished, not guaranteed, not safe from whatever the next difficulty would be. Just alive in a way it hadn't been. Changed back into something that was working again. The scout shuffled away eventually, onto other things. Evelyn stayed at the fence a little longer, looking out at the hill in the failing light, feeling the weight of the winter behind her and the long uncertainty of what still lay ahead. And she did something she hadn't allowed herself to do since November. She let herself believe it. Not completely, not without reservation, just enough to feel it. The small, fragile, real possibility that she had been right, that the land had been waiting and not dying, that Thomas's knowledge lived in those books for a reason, that the decision she'd made with her last real money in a cold auction barn in January had been the right one. She let herself believe it just enough that when she walked back to the house, her step was different from what it had been. She didn't sleep well that night either, but the reason was different. The blossoms didn't come all at once, which was probably why they hit harder than they would have if they had. It would have been easier, in a way, if the whole orchard had simply erupted overnight. One dramatic morning, everything white, the kind of before and after that makes a clean story. Instead, it happened the way most real things happen, incrementally and without ceremony, tree by tree across the south hill, the white appearing in small clusters on one branch, and then another, and then a neighboring tree, and then 3 more on the far east edge, spreading in the particular unhurried logic of biological systems that don't care about your timeline or your bank deadline or the fact that you've been waiting 5 months for visible confirmation that you weren't wrong. By the 1st of May, 31 of the 47 trees in the orchard were showing active bloom. Evelyn had stopped counting after the first week of April. Counting had started to feel like pressing on something that needed to be left alone. Instead, she walked the orchard every morning the way she'd been walking it all winter, checking, observing, noting what had changed overnight. Except that now what she found each morning was more than the day before, and the accumulation of that had a quality she didn't have precise language for. Not joy, exactly. Something older and quieter than joy. She didn't tell the bank until she had photographs that showed what she needed them to show. She tried to photograph the orchard twice in April, and both times the images had come back flat. Her phone camera indifferent to context, capturing pixels without capturing meaning, making the blossoms look like any blossoms on any trees rather than what they actually were, which was evidence of something that should not have been possible according to everyone who had looked at this land in October and made their quiet, careful assessments. Marcus drove down the second weekend of May with his girlfriend, a woman named Diane, who worked in urban planning and had a direct, unimpressed manner that Evelyn had liked from the first time she met her. They arrived Saturday morning, and Marcus walked straight through the house and out the back door without taking his coat off, the way people do when the thing they came to see is outside. Evelyn followed him to the gate. He stood there for a while without speaking. The orchard on the south hill in early May morning light, with the bloom near full now on most of the surviving trees, had a quality that was difficult to look at directly for reasons that had nothing to do with brightness. It was the kind of sight that makes you feel something you can't immediately name and that you're not sure you want to examine too closely. Marcus's jaw was working slightly. Evelyn recognized that. It was what he did when he was keeping his face neutral against something that was trying to move it. 41 trees, she said. He looked at her. 41 confirmed bloom, she said. 6 that I think are still deciding. The 6 on the far north edge. Those were the worst ones in October. They might come, they might not, but 41 is confirmed. He looked back at the orchard. He swallowed once. Mom, he said, and then stopped, because there wasn't a sentence that finished that correctly. I know, she said. They stood at the gate for a few minutes, the two of them, not going in yet, just looking. Diane stood a few feet back with the tact of someone who understood she was witnessing something that had a context she could only partially access, and she stayed quiet and let them have it. Finally, Marcus pushed the gate open and walked in, and Evelyn walked in behind him, and they went through the orchard slowly, the way you walk through a place when you're trying to hold all of it at once. He touched a branch here and there, but not examining, just touching. She walked beside him without narrating. Some things don't need a guide. Near the center of the orchard, at the base of the tree where she'd felt the difference in the bark back in February, the tree she'd privately written off and then refused to write off, Marcus stopped and looked up into the branches, which were white with bloom so thick the individual blossoms were hard to distinguish. This one was the worst one, she said. Extension agent pointed to it first. And you, February, she said. I felt something in the bark. I didn't tell you. He looked at her. Why not? Because I couldn't explain it, and I needed it to stay mine until I could. He looked back up at the tree. Dad would have felt the same thing, he said. He would have known what it meant, and he wouldn't have been able to explain it either. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The bank meeting was scheduled for May 9th, a Wednesday, and Evelyn drove into town alone because that was how she'd been handling the bank from the beginning, and she didn't see a reason to change it now. She brought the photographs Marcus had taken on Saturday, proper photographs, on his camera, not her phone, and they showed the orchard the way it needed to be seen. She brought the soil readings she'd requested from a private agricultural testing service in March, a $40 expenditure she hadn't mentioned to anyone, which showed the before and after composition of the worked soil sections. She brought the vet records showing the health trajectory of the animals. She brought the original farming text she'd worked from, Thomas's handwritten notes visible in the margins, because she'd decided that was relevant context and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. She laid everything on Gerald's desk in a measured order, and Gerald looked through it with the careful attention of someone who was adjusting his understanding of a situation he'd had one model of and was encountering evidence for another. He asked her projected yield for the fall. She told him what the literature suggested for first-year recovery on a restored orchard, with the specific caveat that this was a first recovery season and she was not going to promise numbers she couldn't guarantee. He asked about the pigs, their current status, her plans for them. She told him she was moving them off the orchard now that the bloom season was active, rotating them to the north field where the pasture needed work, with the intention of selling the majority in late summer at a weight that would recoup more than twice what she'd paid in January. He wrote something. He looked at the photographs again. He looked at one of the soil reports. Mr. Vance mentioned the property visit in his report, Gerald said. He noted that the soil condition was more advanced in recovery than he'd expected. Yes, she said. He also noted, and this is slightly outside standard reporting, Gerald glanced at the paper, that, in his opinion, the borrower demonstrated a sophisticated working knowledge of the property's specific restoration needs. Evelyn didn't say anything to that. Which is, Gerald said, putting the paper down carefully, not language we see in these reports very often. She walked out of the bank 45 minutes later with a restructured note, not forgiven, not erased, but reshaped into something workable. A lower monthly payment through the harvest season, a balloon payment in November contingent on the fall yield, and a formal acknowledgement in the paperwork that the property had demonstrated active productive capacity. She sat in Thomas's truck in the bank parking lot for a few minutes before starting the engine. She wasn't thinking about the money exactly, or the bank, or even the paperwork she'd just signed. She was thinking about a Tuesday morning in January when she'd walked into a cold auction barn with $400 and a paddle with a cracked handle, and the specific quality of the silence inside her as she'd kept that paddle up with Dale Rutherford's voice carrying across the room. She started the truck and drove home. The week after the bank meeting was when the community's relationship to what was happening on the South Hill began, in its slow and mostly unannounced way, to shift. It didn't happen dramatically. It happened the way attitudes change in small counties, through accumulation, through the quiet revision of private assessments, through the specific mechanism of people driving past a piece of land they'd written off and finding that their eyes told them something different from what they'd expected. She noticed cars slowing on the road below the orchard. Not stopping, not yet, just slowing the way drivers slow when something in their peripheral vision doesn't match their stored image of a place. She'd driven that road herself hundreds of times. She knew what the orchard had looked like for the past 3 years from the road below. Gray and still and wrong, in the particular way that agricultural failure looks wrong, like a gap in the teeth of the landscape. What it looked like now, from the road below, in the second week of May, was white on green on the south slope of the hill. The bloom at near full coverage on the surviving trees, which from a distance created an effect that was frankly startling if you had the previous image still stored in your mind. She heard about it at the feed store first. She'd gone in on a Thursday for a supply run, and Pete Garvey, who'd been running the store for 23 years and had laughed, she knew, at the story of the pigs back in January. Not meanly, just in the way information that sounds unlikely gets laughed at, met her at the counter with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "My wife drove past your place Tuesday," he said. "All right," she said. "She called me from the road," he said. "Said I needed to come see." Evelyn pulled out her list. "You got a 40-pound bag of—" "I came by yesterday morning," he said. "I didn't stop. I just looked." She looked at him. Pete Garvey had a face that had been arranged by decades of practicality into something that didn't yield expression easily, but it was yielding now, slightly, around the eyes. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't," she said. "In January, when I heard about the pigs—" "Pete," she said, "you didn't know what I was doing. I didn't tell you. You made a reasonable assessment of the information you had. So did everyone else." She put her list on the counter. 40-pound bag of mineral supplement, 2 rolls of electric fence wire, and whatever you've got for hog panels in 14-foot sections. He looked at her for a moment, and then something in his face settled into something more like itself, and he went to pull her order. Dale came by that same week, on a Friday, and this time he didn't come to the field or the orchard. He knocked on the back door, which almost no one did, and stood on the step with his hat in his hands in a way that was so unlike him that Evelyn stared at him for a second before stepping back to let him in. She made coffee because there was nothing else to do when someone stood at your kitchen table with their hat in their hands. He sat down. He looked at his coffee. "I said some things at that auction," he said. "You said some things at that auction," she agreed. "Loud enough that people heard." "Yes." He turned the mug in his hands. "I've been farming this county since I was 22 years old," he said. "I've watched a lot of people make decisions I thought were mistakes. Some of them were. I've been right more often than I've been wrong, which is maybe why being wrong doesn't sit well with me." "I understand that," she said. "What you did—" He stopped, started again. "What you did with that orchard isn't something I knew was possible. That's not an excuse for what I said. I want to say it clearly. I didn't know. And I said it loud enough in public that it mattered, and that wasn't right." Evelyn looked at him. Dale Rutherford, 61 years old, 500 acres, 31 years of being right, sitting in her kitchen holding a coffee mug and delivering the closest thing to a real apology she'd ever heard from a man who treated apology like surrender. "Thank you," she said. She meant it without complication. He nodded. He drank some coffee. He looked out the window at the South Hill, which from the kitchen window showed just the upper edge of the orchard, the white of the bloom visible against the sky. "I told you I had a compacted section," he said. "East Field," she said. 6 years. I've been thinking about it." "I said come back in the fall," she said. "That offer stands." He looked at her. "You'd help me." "You farmed this county for 31 years," she said. "You know things I don't know. I know one thing you don't know. That seems like a reasonable exchange. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made the sound again, the one that wasn't quite a laugh, and drank the rest of his coffee and stood up. Thomas was lucky, he said at the door. He knew that. I don't think he said it enough. She didn't have anything to say to that. He put his hat back on and went out, and she heard his truck start and pull away, and she stood at the window looking at the orchard until the sound of the engine faded. The May visit that she hadn't expected, the one she hadn't planned for and hadn't known how to want, came on a Saturday morning in the third week of the month. She heard a car she didn't recognize pull up the lane and stop. And when she came around the side of the barn, she found a woman she knew by sight, but not well. Margaret Ostroff, who lived 4 miles south and had lost her husband 2 years before Evelyn lost Thomas, and who Evelyn had spoken to exactly twice at community events, in the polite and slightly careful way that people speak to each other across a shared experience they haven't been invited to discuss. Margaret was in her mid-60s, small, with the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of deliberate maintenance, and she was standing at the lane looking toward the south hill with her hands in her cardigan pockets. She turned when Evelyn came around the barn. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I heard about the orchard." "No," Evelyn said, "I don't mind." "I drove past last week and I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing," Margaret said. She had a way of speaking that was very direct without being blunt. She chose her words carefully and then committed to them. "I wanted to see it properly." Evelyn opened the gate. They walked through the orchard together, the two of them, and Evelyn let Margaret set the pace, which was slow and deliberate and involved a lot of stopping to look at individual trees. Margaret didn't ask the questions most people asked, not how many trees, not what the method was, not whether it would hold for fall. She just looked, in the quiet way of someone who had learned to take the measure of things by looking at them rather than asking about them. Near the center of the orchard, Margaret stopped at the tree with the heaviest bloom, the one Evelyn had felt in February, the one she'd nearly given up on. "This was the worst one?" Margaret said. Evelyn looked at her. "How did you know?" "Because it's compensating," Margaret said. "It bloomed harder than the others. Trees do that sometimes when they've been close to the edge." She touched a branch with one finger. "Emmett had a tree like this. Different kind. Cherry, not apple. He nearly cut it down twice." Evelyn didn't say anything. "He didn't, obviously," Margaret said. "It outlived him." They stood in the orchard for a while longer without much conversation, which was the right kind of quiet. Not uncomfortable, not loaded, just two women standing in a place that had come back from something. Walking out, Margaret stopped at the gate and turned to look back at the south hill. "How did you know to keep going?" she said. "In the winter, when there was nothing to see yet." Evelyn thought about it seriously, because the question deserved a serious answer. "I didn't know," she said. "I just couldn't stop." Margaret looked at her. She nodded once, slowly, in the way of someone who knows exactly what that means and didn't need a longer explanation. She left without ceremony, the way she'd arrived, and Evelyn watched her car go down the lane and turn onto the road and disappear, and she thought about that, the difference between knowing and not being able to stop. And she thought it might be the most honest answer she'd given anyone since January. The last week of May, the county extension agent came back. His name was Warren Pruitt, and he arrived in his official truck with the county seal on the door, and he walked up the lane with the expression of a man who was not entirely sure how to behave in a situation he had contributed to and would now prefer to navigate without explicit acknowledgement of that contribution. Evelyn did not make it easier for him. She was not cruel about it. She was never cruel. That wasn't her nature. But she didn't offer him the social lubrication of pretending October hadn't happened, because it had happened and it had mattered, and she didn't believe in false warmth as a kindness. She walked him through the orchard. She let the orchard do the talking, because the orchard now could speak for itself. He was thorough, to his credit. He examined the soil in multiple sections, not just the surface, but getting his hand down into it, checking depth of aeration, checking moisture retention. He walked the perimeter. He looked at the trees with the professional attention he'd given them in October, and the difference between what he'd seen then and what he was seeing now was written on his face, whether he wanted it to be or not. At the eastern tree line, he stopped and turned to her. The soil recovery here is more advanced than I'd expect from any standard remediation method, he said. He had the manner of someone delivering findings, which was the register he was most comfortable in, and she understood that was how he was going to handle this and let him have it. It's not a standard remediation method, she said. No, he said. I understand that now. He looked at the trees. The bloom coverage it's beyond what I'd have projected for this stand, given the condition in October. Yes, she said. He looked at her. He had a notebook in his hand that he hadn't written in. What you did here, he said, and then he stopped for a moment, and she watched him find the version of this he could deliver. This represents a level of site-specific knowledge that I underestimated when I came out in October. It was the closest he was going to get, and she knew it, and she accepted it. Thomas spent 23 years on this land, she said. I spent 23 years watching him. Warren Pruitt looked at the orchard for a long moment. Then he opened his notebook and wrote something in it, and she thought about what it might say and decided it didn't matter. I'd like to write something up, he said, if you're willing, about the method and the outcomes. The Extension Service publishes a quarterly. There are farmers in this county and 3 counties over who have compacted orchard soil. He stopped again. This is worth knowing about. She thought about Thomas's books on the shelf, the margins full of his handwriting, the knowledge he'd gathered over decades about this specific piece of ground and what it needed. Yes, she said, I'd be willing. He left 2 hours later with 3 pages of notes and 20 photographs and the awkward departure posture of a man who had been revised by a situation and was still integrating that. Evelyn closed the gate behind him and stood alone in the orchard. May's late afternoon light was doing what it always does in that part of the country, turning gold and long, laying itself across the hillside in a way that made everything it touched look slightly more permanent than it was. The blossoms on the nearest trees caught that light and held it. The soil under her feet, which had been packed clay in October and frozen ground in January and muddy chaos in the April rain, was dark and yielding and smelled the way productive ground is supposed to smell. The 42 animals that had started this, most of them now moved to the north field, rotated off the orchard as the bloom season required, had left behind something you couldn't see in a single moment but could feel if you'd been paying attention all winter. A transformation that had happened in layers, quietly, underground, without any of the drama that most people expected transformation to look like. She bent down and picked up a handful of soil from the base of the nearest tree and held it in her palm. It was different. She didn't need the soil report to tell her that. She'd known it in February, and she'd known it in March, and she knew it now. Not as a hope, not as a theory, but as a fact that the ground had been demonstrating consistently for 4 months while everyone else's attention was elsewhere. She let the soil fall back from her fingers and brushed her hand on her jeans and straightened up. The South Hills stretched above her, white with bloom against the May sky, the old trees standing in the late light exactly as they'd stood through every season for decades before she and Thomas had come here. And as they'd stand, she allowed herself to believe it now, fully and without reservation, through seasons she hadn't yet seen. She stood there until the light began to go. Then she went in to start dinner, because the animals still needed feeding in the morning, and the bank paperwork needed filing, and the north field fence had a section that needed attention before the weekend, and life on a farm does not pause for the moments that change it, which is either the hardest or the most merciful thing about it, depending on the day. June arrived without asking anyone's permission, which is what June does. The bloom had peaked in mid-May, and then done what blossoms do, let go, petal by petal, until the white was gone and what remained was the small, hard beginning of fruit. Thousands of them across 41 trees, no bigger than the end of your thumb, green and tight and utterly unpromising in the way that all beginnings are unpromising if you don't know what you're looking at. Evelyn knew what she was looking at. She walked the orchard every morning the way she'd been walking it since January, but the quality of those walks had changed. In January, they'd been surveillance, checking for disaster, counting animals, looking for the small signs of either progress or failure that would tell her whether she'd made the right call. In February and March, they'd been acts of faith, which she'd never admit out loud because faith was too clean a word for what it actually felt like, which was more like stubbornness with nowhere better to go. In April and May, the walks had taken on the quality of witnessing. She was no longer checking so much as watching, the way you watch something unfold that you've had a hand in but no longer control. June's walks felt different from all of those. Quieter. The urgency that had been her constant companion since November had not disappeared. The bank deadline was still out there. The November payment still needed to be real before it could be made, but it had shifted registers. The frantic private quality of the winter was behind her. What remained was work, which she understood, and time, which she was learning to be less afraid of. The pigs were on the north field now, all 42 of them, doing to that ground what they'd done to the orchard soil, breaking it open, returning it to itself. She'd sold 4 of the smallest ones in late May, animals that hadn't gained the way the others had, and the money had covered the vet bill remainder and left a small amount over that she'd put directly against the note. Not enough to matter much to the math, but enough to matter to her. The torn-eared scout was not among the 4 she'd sold. She hadn't made that decision consciously. She'd looked at the list of animals she'd tagged for the first sale, and he wasn't on it, and she hadn't added him, and she hadn't examined why. She examined it once, early in June, standing at the north field fence watching the animals work, and she decided that some decisions were entitled to be made by something other than arithmetic, and left it at that. Marcus drove down again in the second week of June, this time alone. And this time the visit felt different from all his previous ones, less freighted, less caught between worry and restraint. He came through the back door and poured himself coffee without being offered it, and sat at the kitchen table with the ease of someone who had stopped needing to manage the situation and was just present in it. They sat together for a while. The morning light came through the east window the way it always did at that hour, laying a long rectangle across the floor that moved slowly toward the table as they talked. "Diane wants to see it in the fall," he said, "when there's actual fruit." "She's welcome anytime," Evelyn said. He turned his mug in both hands, the way Thomas used to turn his. She'd never noticed that about Marcus before, that particular gesture. And noticing it now produced a feeling she couldn't quite place. Not sad exactly, more like a recognition of continuity, of the ways people carry each other forward without knowing they're doing it. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said, "back in February, about needing to do this without questions for a while." "I think I've been asking questions instead of helping," he said, "for a long time. Before Dad died too, not just after. I thought the questions were helpful. I thought I was being realistic." "You were being realistic," she said. "The questions weren't wrong." "They weren't right either," he said. "Not the way I was asking them." She looked at him. He was looking at the table. "Your father did the same thing sometimes," she said. Asked the hard questions out loud before he'd finished thinking them through. He called it thinking by talking. He said some people do that. She paused. "I told him once that I preferred people who think first and then talk. He said that was because I was afraid of being seen while I was still figuring things out." Marcus looked up. "He was right," she said. "Doesn't mean his way was wrong, too." Her son sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "He was right about a lot of things." "He was right about this land," she said. "That was the main one." They went out to the orchard together after breakfast, and Marcus walked through it with a different quality of attention than he'd brought in May. Less amazement, more ownership, the way you look at something you've accepted is real, and are now beginning to simply see as part of the landscape of your life. He stopped at the tree in the center, the one with the heaviest bloom that had set the most fruit, and looked up into the branches at the small green clusters developing there. "These are going to be good," he said. Not wishfully, just observationally. "If the summer cooperates," she said. "When doesn't it cooperate just enough to be annoying?" he said, which was such a Thomas thing to say that they both felt it simultaneously, and neither of them said anything about it, just stood under the tree for a moment with that between them. He went home Sunday afternoon and called her that evening from the road, which he hadn't done before. "Just checking you got the gate closed," he said. "The gate's been closed every night for 6 months, she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to call." She smiled at the phone, alone in the kitchen. "Drive safe," she said. July was when the community finished making up its mind. It happened in the way these things happen in small counties. Not through any single event or declaration, but through the accumulated weight of people's revised private assessments, becoming public enough that a new consensus formed around them. The orchard had been the county's quiet joke in January. By July, it was the county's quiet pride, which is how these places work. They claim the things that succeed as readily as they dismiss the things that look like they might fail, and the people in them are sometimes honest enough to acknowledge the gap. Warren Pruitt's article appeared in the Extension Service Quarterly in late June. He'd titled it something technical about soil restoration practices, but he'd included enough of Evelyn's story, the method, the timeline, the outcome, that it read as a case study in the specific sense of that word. This is what one person did with this specific problem, and here is what happened. He'd sent her a copy before it published and asked if she had changes. She'd had 2 small factual corrections and no others. She didn't know how widely it circulated, but she got 3 phone calls in the first 2 weeks of July from farmers she'd never spoken to. 2 were from the adjacent county. One was from further south, a woman who had an old peach orchard and a soil problem that sounded familiar, and a voice that carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for long enough that they'd started wondering if they were the problem. Evelyn talked to each of them for as long as they needed. She didn't oversell what she'd done or promise outcomes she couldn't guarantee. She described the method and the timeline and the investment and the uncertainty and let them make their own assessments. One of them sent her a note afterward, handwritten, which people almost never did anymore, that said simply, "Thank you for not making it sound easier than it is." She kept that note on the kitchen table for a week before putting it in the drawer with Thomas's important papers. The feed store visit happened on a Tuesday in mid-July, and it was the one she hadn't expected. She'd gone in for routine supplies, the errand she made every 2 weeks. And Pete Garvey was at the counter the way he was always at the counter, and there was a young man standing at the far end of the store looking at a display of soil amendments with the concentrated attention of someone who doesn't quite know what they're looking for, but knows they need something. He was maybe 30, with the build of someone who'd grown up doing physical work and hadn't stopped. And he had the look Evelyn had come to recognize. The look of someone carrying a problem they don't have the vocabulary for yet. Pete caught her eye and tilted his head toward the young man in the almost imperceptible way of someone who is suggesting something without committing to it. She went over. "Help you find something?" she said. He looked at her with the mild startlement of someone who hadn't noticed her approach. "Maybe. I'm trying to fix a soil problem. Old orchard, my grandfather's place." He gestured vaguely at the display. "I don't know what I need." "What does the soil do?" she said. He described it. The compaction, the drainage failure, the way the trees had progressively declined over 6 years despite everything he'd tried. He described it with the careful, slightly defeated language of someone who had tried the available solutions and run out of them. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Have you thought about pigs?" He stared at her. "Pigs. Not as product," she said. "As a restoration tool. Specific method. Takes a season. Works if the trees still have root viability." He kept looking at her. "My grandfather had pigs," he said slowly. "He used to run them through that orchard. I always thought it was I thought he was letting them forage." "He probably was," she said, "and restoring the soil. Both things at the same time." The young man was quiet for a moment, and she could see him reorganizing something. The image of his grandfather in that orchard, probably, the thing he'd half seen and not understood as a child, which now acquired a meaning it hadn't had before. "How do I know if the trees are still viable?" he said. "Feel the bark," she said. "Not the branches. The trunk, below the main fork. If it feels like bark, there's still something there. If it feels like wood that's dried all the way through, you've waited too long." She paused. "Go check before you buy anything." He nodded. He looked like he was about to leave immediately. "Come back when you've checked," she said. "If the bark's still alive, I'll tell you the rest." He came back the following Saturday. She wasn't at the feed store. He'd gotten her number from Pete Garvey, which she'd expected, and he called from his truck in his grandfather's orchard and described what his hand was telling him about the bark. "It's not dry," he said. "It feels... I don't know how to describe it." "You don't have to describe it," she said. "You know the difference." "Yeah." he said quietly. I do. His name was Cody Marsh, and over the following week she talked to him 4 times, each time longer than the last, walking him through the method the way she'd worked through it herself. The sourcing of animals, the rotation schedule, the winter management, the signs of soil change to watch for, and the ones to ignore. She sent him photographs of her soil reports before and after. She drove out to his grandfather's place once, in late July, and walked the orchard with him and confirmed what his hands had already told him. The orchard was not dead. It was waiting. She said that to him standing between the trees on his grandfather's south field, and she heard herself say it and heard the echo of it. The thing she'd said to Dale through the fence in January, the thing she'd believed when she had no evidence to show anyone, the thing that had turned out to be true. Your grandfather knew this land, she said. Whatever he did in that orchard, he was doing it for a reason. You've got his reason in the ground still. You just need to finish what he started. Cody Marsh was quiet for a while, looking at the trees. He died before he could, he said. Not dramatically, just as a fact that sat heavy. I know the feeling, she said. He looked at her. He knew something of her story by then. Pete Garvey had told him, the way people in small counties tell each other things, selectively and not always accurately, but enough. He nodded once, and that was the conversation, and they walked back to the trucks. The summer moved the way summers do when you're watching something grow. Too slowly in the stretches between visible change and then suddenly forward, as if the growing season had been accumulating interest and was paying it out all at once. The fruit on the South Hill trees went from small and hard and green through the pale yellow-green of mid-development, filling out steadily through July into August, the clusters thickening on the branches until the trees began to carry a visible weight they hadn't carried in 3 years. Evelyn watched it with the particular discipline of someone who had learned not to count things before they were in her hands. She checked for disease. She managed the few trees showing stress from the dry stretch in July with targeted irrigation and the specific attention of someone who had been reading this orchard's needs for a season now and understood its particular language. She lost 8 apples on one tree to a late blight that she caught early and contained, and she felt the loss of those 8 apples with a disproportionate sharpness that surprised her. Not because 8 apples mattered in any practical sense, but because each piece of fruit on those trees had cost something she could still measure, and waste at this scale still registered personally. August was also when she sold the bulk of the pigs. She'd been tracking their weights through the summer and running the numbers the way she'd promised herself she would. Not optimistically, not pessimistically, just accurately, the way Thomas had always kept his books. When the price was right in late August, she moved 31 animals to a buyer in the next county who ran a sustainable operation and paid fair prices and asked her reasonable questions about the animal's management history. She cleared enough from the sale to make a substantial payment against the note. Not the November balloon, that still required the harvest, but enough to change the shape of the math, to give herself margin she hadn't had since January. She sat with the check for a moment before depositing it. $260 in January, 12 times that in late August. From animals that nobody at that auction had thought were worth the ring time. She deposited the check and didn't make a thing of it, because making a thing of it would have required explaining it to someone, and some satisfactions are more complete when they stay private. The harvest began on the 17th of September, a Tuesday, because the 17th was when the fruit was ready regardless of what day of the week it happened to fall on, and orchards don't negotiate schedules. Marcus came down for the first day. He'd asked in August, just mentioned it plainly without making it a production. I'd like to be there for the first day of harvest, if that's all right. And she'd said it was all right because it was. Diane came with him, which Evelyn had not expected and was glad of because Diane had the kind of calm, practical competence that made work go faster without making a performance of it. They started at 6:30 in the morning before the day's heat built, moving through the western section first, the section the pigs had worked earliest, the ground that had been recovering longest. The fruit came off heavy and firm, the kind of apple that had depth to it, not the oversized water weight of fruit pushed by inputs, but the compact density of fruit that had developed slowly on a tree that had to work for it. Evelyn picked in silence for the first hour. It wasn't a contemplative silence or a ceremonial one. It was the silence of work that requires your body and leaves your mind free to go where it wants. And where her mind went was not a place she'd have predicted. She thought about the auction. She thought about the cracked paddle handle and the cold in that barn and Dale's voice carrying across the room. She thought about the first morning she'd released the animals into the western section and stood at the fence watching them work and felt the thing that wasn't quite hope, that she hadn't been able to name then and could name now, which was simply conviction. She'd had no evidence. She'd had Thomas's books and her own understanding of the land and the particular knowledge that comes from decades of watching someone pay careful attention to something, and she'd put all of that against the judgment of everyone who had written the outcome in advance, and she'd turned out to be right. Not because she was exceptional. She knew that. She was a 64-year-old woman with an aching back and a wood stove that still worked only when it wanted to, and a checking account that had $400 in it in January, and a note at the bank that was still not fully paid. She was not exceptional. She had simply refused when the moment required it to accept other people's certainty about her situation as more authoritative than her own knowledge of it. That seemed important to name, even just to herself among the trees. By noon they had filled the first 12 bins. Marcus and Diane worked the eastern section while Evelyn moved through the center, and the particular sound of the harvest, the soft impact of each apple in the bin, the movement of people through the rows, the occasional word passed between them, filled the orchard in the way that only the sounds of productive work fill a space, with a quality that silence can't match. At lunch, they sat on the tailgate of Thomas's truck at the edge of the orchard, and nobody said much because nobody needed to. Diane had brought food, which she'd mentioned to no one. She'd simply brought it, sandwiches and cold coffee and fruit that was not, Evelyn noticed, apples. And they ate and looked out at the trees. "How much do you think?" Marcus said finally. "I don't count before it's in the bins," Evelyn said. "Ballpark." She looked at the trees. She'd been doing the estimation all morning, the way she'd taught herself to estimate through the season. The weight per cluster, the clusters per tree, the trees per section, the deductions for size variance, and any culls. She had a number in her head. She'd had it since the second week of August. "Enough," she said. Marcus looked at her. "Enough for November," she said. "If the pricing holds." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it going to hold?" "I talked to 3 buyers in August," she said. "Local grocery cooperative, a cider producer 2 counties over, and a farm stand operation that does regional distribution. They're all interested. The cider producer especially. He said heritage method fruit is hard to source and he'll pay above commodity for it." She'd saved that sentence for the right moment, and this was the right moment, and she let it sit there. Diane said, "Heritage method fruit." "His words," Evelyn said. "Not mine, but he's not wrong." Marcus made a sound that was not the not-quite laugh of his father, but was adjacent to it. Something released, something that had been held tightly for a long time, letting go a little. He looked at the orchard and then at Evelyn. "Dad would have had a lot to say right now," he said. "He would have said it all at once and then said it again slightly differently," she said. "He would have," Marcus agreed. They sat on the tailgate a while longer. The September afternoon had the particular quality of September afternoons in that part of the country. The light coming in low and gold, the air with the first suggestion of what was coming, the specific and unrepeatable quality of a season ending and leaving something behind. The full harvest took 9 days. She'd brought in 2 part-time workers for days, 4 through 7, local people she knew, and paid them fairly, and the work moved steadily through the sections in the order she'd planned it. The final count, when everything was in and sorted and the culls were separated and the premium fruit was in the cold storage she'd arranged at a facility in the next town, was higher than her August estimate. Not dramatically higher, so this wasn't a story about miraculous abundance, and she would have been suspicious of miraculous abundance anyway. But measurably, meaningfully higher. Enough to change the November calculation from possible to secure. She called Marcus with the final number on a Thursday evening in late September. He didn't say anything for a moment. "That's enough," he said. "It's enough," she confirmed. "Mom." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him since before the funeral, something unclenched, something that had been braced for a long time and had finally allowed itself to stop. "That's enough." "I know," she said. She let him have the moment. She sat at the kitchen table and turned her coffee mug in her hands. Her hands, which were rough from 9 months of work in all weathers, which had carried water and repaired fences and checked soil and felt bark and picked fruit and done the 10,000 ordinary physical things that keeping a farm alive requires. And she let her son process the number through the phone from Indianapolis, and she looked out the window at the South Hill in the last of the evening light. The 6 trees on the north edge of the orchard that she'd worried about through the spring, the ones she'd said were still deciding, had come back late with a partial set, about a third of what the other trees carried. Not enough to count in any serious commercial sense, enough to matter in another sense entirely. She'd picked those trees herself, alone, on the last day of harvest, working slowly through the late afternoon. The fruit from them was small and somewhat irregular, not the premium size she'd sorted into the cold storage, not cider weight. She'd brought it back to the house in 2 small boxes and put it in the kitchen. She hadn't decided yet what to do with it. She'd been thinking about it. The November payment went to the bank on the 8th, 3 days before the deadline, because Evelyn believed in the specific dignity of not waiting until the last moment when you didn't have to. Gerald processed it and sent a receipt and a brief formal acknowledgement that the note was in good standing. She filed the paperwork in the drawer with Thomas's important papers and the handwritten note from the woman who'd thanked her for not making it sound easier than it was. Dale came by the second week of November, as she'd expected he would. He arrived on a Saturday morning when the orchard was bare and the trees were settling into their dormancy, the last of the leaves down and the branches clean against the sky, the ground beneath them dark and maintained in the way of ground that is being properly cared for. He brought his wife, which surprised her. Linda Rutherford was a quiet woman who had always seemed to Evelyn to have better judgment than her husband and the patience to wait for him to use his. She stood at the orchard gate with the particular stillness of someone taking inventory, and then she looked at Evelyn. "He talked about this place all summer," she said. "I know he came out a few times," Evelyn said. "More than a few," Linda said. Dale was already walking through the orchard, looking at the trees in their dormancy, looking at the ground, looking at the fence lines and the management details in the same way he'd looked at everything on his own 500 acres for 30 years. With the attention of someone whose respect for land was the most genuine thing about him, whatever his opinions about people happened to be. He stopped at the center tree and looked up into the bare branches. He put his hand against the trunk. "Coming back next year," he said. Not a question. "Coming back next year," she said. He nodded. He looked at the ground. He took his hand off the tree. "I want to talk about that east field," he said. "Seriously, I've been reading about the method." "I'll need to see the ground before I can tell you anything useful," she said. "Come in spring," he said, "before planting. I'll show you what we're dealing with." She looked at him, Dale Rutherford, who had told an auction barn full of people that someone ought to call the county, who had visited her fence in January with his framework of practical concern and delivered it at volume, who had stood in this orchard in August and said 2 words that had cost him something. I was wrong. People were not simple. She'd known that for 64 years. The ones who hurt you were sometimes the same ones who showed up later with their hat in their hands, and the question of what to do with that was never as clean as you wanted it to be. She didn't think Dale was a changed man. She didn't think one season and one admission remade a person. But she thought that what happened in that orchard had shifted something in him, some fixed point he'd been navigating from, and that was real, even if it was small. "Come in spring," she said. "I'll look at the ground." He nodded. Linda squeezed Evelyn's arm at the gate on the way out, the same gesture Carol had made in the rain in April, and Evelyn thought about that, the way women communicate the things men spend paragraphs working around, and watched them drive down the lane. Carol came by the following week with a pie, which was her version of ceremony, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate it and talked about things that weren't the orchard, about Carol's daughter's new baby, about the winter forecast, about a road near Carol's property that the county had been promising to repave for 4 years. Normal conversation, the conversation of 2 women who'd been neighbors long enough that they didn't need the extraordinary to fill a kitchen. At the end, Carol said, "Thomas would have been loud about this. All fall. You wouldn't have been able to get him to stop talking about it." "No," Evelyn said. "You've been the opposite," Carol said. "I don't know how to be the other way," Evelyn said. Carol looked at her with the reading quality she had, the look of someone who knew you well enough to see around the edges of what you were saying. You should let yourself be proud, Carol said. Not for anyone else, just for yourself. Evelyn thought about that. She thought about the word proud, and whether it fit, and what it would feel like if it did. I'll work on it, she said. The last thing she did with the orchard that year happened on a Sunday in late November, when the cold had come back properly and the ground was hard underfoot, and the sky had the low pewter quality of a sky that is making up its mind about winter. She'd decided about the small fruit from the north edge trees. She packed it into a cardboard box. The irregular apples from the trees that had come back late, the ones she'd picked alone on the last day of harvest. She drove to Margaret Ostroff's house 4 miles south and knocked on the door. Margaret answered and looked at the box, and then at Evelyn, and then at the box again. Trees on the north edge, Evelyn said. Came back late. Fruit small, not premium, but it's from the trees we both thought were finished. Margaret looked at her for a moment. She took the box. Come in, she said. I'll put the kettle on. Evelyn went in. She sat at Margaret's kitchen table, which was different from her own kitchen table, but had the same quality of a place where serious things had been sat with. And Margaret made tea, and they talked about Emmett's cherry tree and Thomas's apple orchard and the specific knowledge that comes from living closely with a piece of land for decades, which is different from book knowledge and different from professional knowledge, and not better than either of them, just different. It's the knowledge of what a thing sounds like when the wind comes from the north, what the soil smells like when it's about to turn, what a particular tree looks like in the third week of August when it's going to have a good year. It's the knowledge that can't be transferred intact. It can only be demonstrated. They sat for 2 hours. When Evelyn left, Margaret stood on the porch with the box of small, irregular apples and said, "Same time next year?" "Same time next year," Evelyn said. She drove home in the early dark, past the road below her property, and she slowed the way drivers had been slowing all summer, out of the same instinct, the instinct to look at the South Hill. The orchard was bare now, dormant, the trees standing in their clean winter lines. There was nothing spectacular about it. It looked like what it was, an orchard going into its rest, conserving itself for what came next, doing what trees do in the dark and cold months that most people never think about, the slow interior work that makes the spring possible. She knew what was happening down in the soil. She'd checked it 3 weeks ago, one last time before the freeze, crouching between the trees with her hand in the dark earth, feeling the texture of it. The biological work didn't stop when the cold came. It slowed. It went underground in every sense, but it continued. The organisms and the organic matter and the root systems all moving at their winter pace toward the longer work of recovery that would not be finished in 1 season or 2. Thomas had known that. It was in the margins of his books, in the patient handwriting she'd read by lamplight, in November and December and through the hard months that followed, the knowledge of a man who understood that the most important work usually happens where nobody can see it. She pulled into the lane and parked behind the barn and sat for a moment in the dark with the engine cooling. The north field fence still had a section that needed attention before the hard freeze. The barn roof had a small issue she'd been watching since October that needed to be addressed before spring. She had a call to return from the cider producer, who wanted to talk about next year's supply. She had a message from Cody Marsh saying that he'd sourced his animals and was ready to start, and could she look at his rotation plan? She had 42 animals in the north field, one of them with a torn ear, doing in the dark and cold what they'd been doing since January. The slow, unglamorous, invisible work that most people would never see and most people would never understand was happening. She got out of the truck. She put on Thomas's coat, which was still on the hook by the back door, which she had still not moved, which she had stopped expecting herself to move on any particular schedule. She went out to do the evening check. The animals were settled. The torn-eared scout was at the far end of the field, near the fence line, the way he always was. A few steps ahead of the others, orienting toward whatever came next, indifferent to the cold and the dark, and the question of whether any of this made sense. She counted 42. She always counted 42. She stood at the fence for a while in the dark and the cold, and she felt the weight of the year behind her. The auction, the January doubt, the February bark, the March bank letter, The April buds, the May blossoms, the summer fruit, the September harvest, the November payment. All of it, in sequence, exactly as it had happened. None of it easy, none of it clean, none of it the way anyone watching from the outside would have predicted. She thought about what she would tell someone if they asked her how she'd done it. She thought about that question and the honest answer to it, which was not the inspiring version, not the version that makes a person sound capable and certain and clear-eyed from the beginning. The honest answer was that she hadn't known. She'd had knowledge, and she'd had Thomas's 23 years, and she'd had the particular stubbornness of someone who couldn't find a better option, and she'd had the minimum necessary resources, and she had refused, every morning when she got up before light and went out into the cold, she had simply refused to accept that the ending everyone else had already written for her was more accurate than the one she was still working on. That was the whole of it. There was no cleaner version. The scout moved along the fence line, always moving, and Evelyn watched him until the cold told her it was time to go in. And then she went in, and she made dinner, and she ate it alone at the kitchen table under the light her husband had chosen for that room 20 years ago. And the farm was quiet around her, and the orchard was dark on the south hill, and somewhere underground the work continued,